I still remember the exact look on that security guard's face. He was maybe mid 40s, heavy set, with a gray uniform that was 2 sizes too big and a lanyard that said his name was Gerald. He stood behind the front desk of the Meridian Tower lobby in downtown Atlanta, all marble floors and floor to ceiling glass. And he looked at me the way people look at someone who has clearly walked into the wrong building. Slowly, with that particular kind of patience that isn't really patience at all. "Can I help you?" he said. And the way he said it, he wasn't asking. He was waiting for me to turn around. I had on a pair of dark jeans I bought from a thrift store off Memorial Drive, a plain white tee, and some clean Air Forces that were starting to show their age on the left sole. I had my natural hair pulled back, no jewelry except for small gold hoops my foster mother Dorothy gave me when I turned 18. I was carrying a canvas tote bag. I looked, by most measurements, like someone who was in that lobby to drop off a package or ask about a job application. "I'm going up to the 14th floor," I told him. He looked at his clipboard, then at me, then back at his clipboard. "Do you have an appointment?" "I don't need one." He smiled then. Not a mean smile, just a practiced one. The kind of smile that says, "I've dealt with people like you before." "Ma'am, the 14th floor is Monroe Capital. That's a private office. I'm going to need you to show a badge or have someone from upstairs confirm you're expected." I didn't argue. I didn't get loud. I just stood there for a second, looked past him at the elevators, and then I pulled out my phone and sent a 2-word text. "I'm downstairs." 40 seconds later, his desk phone rang. He picked it up. His whole posture changed inside of 5 words. Whatever the person on the other end said made him stand up straighter, made his eyes go somewhere between confused and embarrassed. He set the phone down slowly and looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "Ms. Monroe," he said. "I'm... I apologize. Please go right ahead." I smiled at him. A real one, because I didn't blame him for a single second of what just happened. And I walked toward the elevator. That moment right there. That is basically my entire life in one scene. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this story. I need you to understand where I come from, because none of what happened later makes sense without it. I grew up on the west side of Atlanta in a neighborhood called Vine City. If you know Atlanta, you know Vine City. If you don't, just picture tree-lined streets with houses that have stories in their walls. Some of them good stories, some of them hard ones, most of them both at the same time. The kind of neighborhood where everybody knows everybody, where Miss Patterson on the corner still sweeps her own sidewalk every morning at 7, where the sound of someone's gospel music coming through a screen door on a Sunday feels like the most natural thing in the world. That's where Raymond Carter and Dorothy Carter raised me. I want to be careful about how I say this because I have never gotten it quite right. They were my foster parents, but that word, foster, has never felt adequate. Ray was a postal worker for 31 years. He had a laugh that could fill a whole room, the kind of laugh where you laughed to before you even knew what was funny. He had rough hands and a soft way of talking, and he called me baby girl until the day I left for college, and even a few times after that when he forgot himself. Dot, Miss Dorothy Carter, was a woman who could make a Sunday meal out of almost nothing and have everyone at the table feeling like they'd been blessed. She worked in the cafeteria at a middle school for 22 years. She was the kind of woman who ironed her church clothes on Saturday night and prayed out loud in the kitchen while she cooked. Not in a performative way, just like it was as natural as breathing. She had a way of looking at you, just looking, not saying anything, that made you feel both completely seen and completely safe. They took me in when I was 4 years old. I don't remember the days before them, Everything I have ever known about family, about home, about what it means to be loved without condition. I learned inside that house on Ashby Street. But I always knew something was different about me. Not different in the way that made me feel less, more like a quiet awareness I couldn't name. I was good at numbers in a way that surprised my teachers. I had instincts for patterns, for systems, for reading a room, and understanding the undercurrent of it before anyone else said a word. Ray used to say I would have been a hell of a chess player. Dot used to say I had an old soul. There was a birthmark on my left wrist. Small, oval shaped, the color of a bruise that never faded. I'd had it my whole life. It didn't mean anything to me for a long time. And then there was the box. When I was 17, I was helping Dot clear out the hall closet and I found a cardboard box pushed to the back behind some old coats. Inside were the documents from when I first came to them, the case file from the state, some intake paperwork, a few photographs. Most of it was standard, but tucked into the bottom of the box was a folded up newspaper clipping, yellowed at the edges. The headline read, Atlanta, billionaire, Winston Monroe continues search for missing daughter, 4 years after disappearance. There was a photo of a man in a dark suit, and next to him, at some kind of fundraiser gala, was a woman in a red dress. And right there in the article describing the couple was a single detail that made my mouth go dry. Monroe's daughter, Zara, was last seen in October 2002. She has a small oval birthmark on her left wrist. I folded that article back up and put it exactly where I found it. I didn't say anything to Dot. I was 17. I wasn't ready. I didn't do anything with that information for 7 years. 7 years of carrying it like a stone in my pocket. Always there, always present, but tucked away where I didn't have to look at it directly. I finished high school, got a scholarship to Howard University. Dot cried so hard at graduation that she soaked through 2 of the 3 tissues she'd brought. Ray kept his sunglasses on the whole time, even though it was cloudy. I studied finance because the numbers made sense to me in a way nothing else quite did. Graduated, got a job at a firm in DC. And then, one night, I was 24 years old and sitting alone in my apartment, and I ordered one of those mail-in DNA kits. I don't even know exactly why I did it that particular night. I think I was just tired of carrying the stone. The results came back 3 weeks later. Winston Monroe Sr., 99.97% paternal match. I sat on my bathroom floor for a long time after I read that. Not crying, just sitting, just letting the number be real. What followed was 2 years of the most careful, deliberate research I have ever done in my life. I didn't reach out to Winston Monroe right away. I needed to know who he was first. Not what Forbes said about him, not what the press said, but who he actually was. I did background research. I talked to people who'd worked for him. I read everything. And slowly, over months, I started to believe he was a man worth knowing. When I finally did reach out through a private attorney, Winston Monroe drove 6 hours to meet me on a Tuesday morning at a coffee shop in Charlotte, North Carolina. He came alone. He walked in, saw me sitting at the corner table, and stopped walking. Just stopped. He stood there for a long moment, and I saw something move across his face that I don't have a clean word for, like something broken, finally finding its other half. He sat down across from me. He didn't try to hug me. He just said, "You have your grandmother's eyes." We talked for 5 hours that day. Over the next year and a half, I learned the business. I spent time inside Monroe Capital, working quietly, using a different last name, learning the operations from the inside out. The leadership team eventually found out who I was. Winston made me a board member. And then, after everything had been confirmed and structured properly, he named me chairwoman. I was 26 years old. I hadn't told anyone. Not my friends, not my coworkers, and not Ray and Dot. That part was the hardest. Every time I talked to them on the phone, and I called every Sunday without fail, I was holding this enormous thing and saying nothing because I needed to do it right. I needed to come home and tell them face to face. I needed to see them first. And then I got a call from Dot that changed my timeline. She called me on a Wednesday evening in November. Her voice was steady the way it always is, but I knew her well enough to hear the thing underneath the steadiness. "Baby, there's some people been coming around," she said, "sending letters about the house, saying there's some development deal and that the neighborhood is being rezoned. Ray went down to the city office, but they just kept sending him in circles." I asked her to take a picture of the paperwork and send it to me. When it came through, I read every word carefully. It was a notice of displacement from a real estate development project, a mixed-use development that was buying up a section of properties in Vine City for a high-end residential and commercial build-out. The project was being backed by Monroe Capital's real estate arm, my father's company. My company. I stared at that document for a long time, and then I booked the first flight back to Atlanta I could find. I want to be honest about what I felt on that flight home, because it wasn't simple. There was anger, a deep, quiet kind of anger that I've learned over the years is more dangerous than the loud kind. There was this horrible, almost ironic heaviness. The company I had just spent 2 years learning, the company I had just taken partial control of, was the same company that was trying to push my parents out of the house they'd lived in for 30 years. I thought about my father, Winston. I believed him when he said he cared. I believed his intentions. But this told me something about the layers of a corporation, that even when the person at the top has good values, there are decisions being made at the regional level by people who only see numbers on a spreadsheet. People who had flagged that block of Ashby Street as an acquisition target without knowing what was on it, without knowing who was in it. I didn't call Winston on that flight. I didn't call Andre. I just sat in 24C with my window shade open and watched Atlanta come into view below me and thought about Ray's hands, about Dot's voice, about 30 years of that house. I landed and went straight there. The neighborhood looked exactly the same, the way good places do. Not because nothing changes, but because the things that make them what they are stay somehow constant. The same magnolia tree at the end of the block, the same mural on the side of Mr. Ellis's shop, the one the kids from the community center painted back in 2011. The smell of somebody grilling, even in November. Ray was on the porch when the Uber pulled up. He stood up when he saw me, and his whole face opened up the way it always does. He came down those 3 porch steps and wrapped me up before I'd even fully cleared the car door. "Baby girl," he said against the top of my head. "What are you doing here?" "Missed you," I said. He pulled back and looked at me with those eyes that always saw too much. "You look like you've been thinking too hard." "When don't I?" He laughed, that laugh, and held the door open. Dot was in the kitchen. She dried her hands on a dish towel and hugged me for a long time without saying anything. That was always her way. Words later, touch first. We sat around the kitchen table the way we always did, with sweet tea and whatever Dot had made, and we talked about everything except what I'd come there about. Ray's bum knee. The neighbors. A new pastor at the church they liked. Normal things, beautiful things. And then we heard the front door. Renee Carter had a key to that house because she was Ray's sister, and Ray was too generous a man to ever take it back, even after reasons presented themselves. She walked in without knocking. She never knocked. And behind her was her son Marcus, who came in already looking around the room like he was doing a mental appraisal. Renee was dressed sharp, the way she always was. Hair done, nails done, somewhere between performative church ready and real estate open house casual. She'd done well for herself, married a man with a good income, lived in a nice house in Stone Mountain, and she never let anyone in a 5-mile radius forget it. She saw me, and her expression did that thing it always did. A quick scan, head to toe, then a reset into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Zara," she said, "when'd you get in?" "This afternoon," I said. "Oh." A pause. Her eyes swept over my outfit again. The thrift store jeans, the plain tee. "You came straight from the airport looking like that?" Ray shifted in his seat. "Renee." "I'm just saying," she said, holding her hands up. "I'm just saying, Ray. You always worked so hard. I'd think by now your daughter could at least—" She trailed off into a gesture that encompassed my entire person. Marcus had settled himself into the armchair in the living room the way he always did, like he owned the place. He had on a quarter zip that probably cost $400, and he had a way of sitting that took up maximum space. "You still at that same firm in D.C.?" he asked, not looking up from his phone. "I'm not in D.C. anymore," I said. "Oh yeah? Where you at?" "I'm between things," I said. He looked up then. That small smile. "Right, right." The tone that said, "I knew it. Still going nowhere." Dot put her hand over mine on the table, just for a second, just enough. The thing about Renee and Marcus, and I want to be fair here, is that they weren't purely mean people. They were people who had decided, somewhere along the way, that the only value worth having was visible value, money you could see, status you could point to, and if you couldn't show them yours, they would tell you what yours was worth, which was nothing. They'd been doing it to Ray and Dot for years. Subtle comments about the house being dated, questions about retirement savings delivered like criticisms, little jabs about the neighborhood wrapped in concern. And Ray and Dot were too loving, too dignified to ever really push back. I had watched it my whole life. I was watching it again now. Renee sat down and started in on the real reason she and Marcus were there. "Ray, we need to talk about this letter from Monroe Capital. Me and Marcus looked into it. That's a serious operation. You cannot fight these people. You know what happened to the Hendersons on Markham? They held out for 3 months, and then they took the offer because there was no other choice." She folded her hands on the table. "I'm not saying it's fair. I'm saying you need to be smart." "It's our home," Dot said quietly. "Dorothy, I know that. But at a certain point, being emotional about it doesn't help you. They're going to build what they're going to build, and you can either get something out of it or you can get nothing." Ray was quiet. He had the look he got when he was holding something in. Jaw set, eyes down at the table. "There's also the money," Marcus added. "Offer they made isn't nothing. You could get a real nice place out in Clayton County. Fresh start." "This is a real nice place," Ray said, and his voice was very even. The room got quiet the way rooms do right before something either explodes or deflates. I asked Dot if I could see the paperwork. She got up and came back with a manila folder, the official notice, some supplementary documents about the project, a letter with a contact name for the Monroe Capital Regional Office. I read through it slowly. Every paragraph, every clause. I read the name of the regional director who'd authorized the displacement proceedings. I read the project code. I looked at the date the flag had been placed on the property, 8 months ago. And then I turned to the last page and I read the development name. Meridian Vine City Mixed Use Initiative. Meridian. The same word on the sign in that lobby I had stood in this morning, the same building, the same project. It hadn't been a coincidence that I'd gone there today. Andre had given me a briefing on the project weeks ago as part of my onboarding into the real estate division's portfolio. I had read the file. I had not known, until this moment, that one of the addresses in the acquisition cluster was 1847 Ashby Street, Atlanta, Georgia. My parents' house. I set the papers down very carefully on the table. I looked at Ray's hands, rough and still, resting next to his glass of sweet tea. I looked at Dot, who was watching me with that quiet attention of hers, not pressing, just present. I could feel Renee watching me too, waiting for me to confirm that I didn't know what to do either, waiting for me to agree that Ray and Dot should take the money and go. I did not agree. I picked up my phone from where it sat beside me on the table, screened down the way I always keep it, and I turned it over. The phone felt heavier than it should have. Not literally. It was the same phone I'd been carrying for 2 years, same weight, same cracked corner on the case that I kept meaning to replace. But sitting there at that kitchen table, with Renee watching me from across the room, and Ray's hand resting still beside his sweet tea, and Dot's quiet presence somewhere just behind my left shoulder, in that moment, making that call felt like stepping through a door I could not walk back through. I excused myself, told them I needed some air. Ray nodded like he understood more than I'd said. He usually did. I went out the back door into the small yard behind the house. Dot kept a garden back there, not a formal one, just a stretch of earth along the fence where she grew tomatoes every summer, and collard greens and a few herbs she used in the kitchen. In November, it was just dark soil, and the dried-out remains of the season. I stood near the fence in the cold, and I dialed Andre. He picked up on the second ring. "I need you to do something for me tonight," I said, keeping my voice low. "The Meridian Vine City project. There's an address in the acquisition cluster, 1847 Ashby Street. I need it pulled from the list, flagged as off limits, tonight, not tomorrow." There was a brief pause on his end, not hesitation, just processing. Andre Cole had been with Monroe Capital for 11 years. He was precise, and he was fast, and he did not ask unnecessary questions. "Consider it done," he said. "Anything else?" The regional director who authorized the displacement filings for that block. "I want his file on my desk." The full record. Performance reviews, decisions he signed off on in the last 18 months, everything. "I'll have it compiled by morning." "Thank you, Andre." I hung up and stood in the dark for a moment, listening to the neighborhood. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking at something. A car moved slowly past the front of the house, its headlights sweeping across the side fence. Above me, the sky over Atlanta had that amber glow that cities give off at night. Not quite dark, never fully dark. I stayed out there longer than I needed to. Not because I was still thinking about the call. That was done. I stayed because I needed a few minutes to just be a person standing in my mother's garden before I went back inside and had to be everything else again. What I didn't know was that Renee had moved to the kitchen to get herself a glass of water, and the kitchen window was cracked. She heard enough. Not everything, not the address, not Andre's name, not anything specific. But she heard my tone. She heard pulled from the list and authorization and tonight. And Renee Carter was a woman who heard what she wanted to hear in the gaps between what was actually said. When I came back inside, she was leaning against the kitchen counter with her arms crossed and a look on her face that was somewhere between suspicious and entertained. "Who you calling out there, Zara? You got some kind of lawyer or something?" "Just a friend," I said. She tilted her head. Because it sounded more official than that. It wasn't. She looked at me for another second, deciding whether to push it. Then she smiled, that smile, and let it go. Stored it somewhere in the back of her mind where she kept things she planned to revisit. I sat back down next to Ray and he asked me quietly if everything was all right. I told him yes. And in that moment, it was the truest yes I had given anyone in a long time. Because for the first time since I'd landed in Atlanta, something had shifted. The heaviness that had been sitting on my chest since I read that folder, it hadn't disappeared, but it had reorganized itself into something I could carry differently, something I had acted on instead of just held. Ray reached over and patted my hand once, the way he did. Didn't say anything else. Marcus, from the living room, called out, "Y'all watching the game later?" Nobody answered him. 3 days passed. Normal, ordinary days. The kind I hadn't let myself have in a long time. I helped Dot organize the hall closet. I sat with Ray on the porch while he talked about the Falcons, and I mostly just listened because listening to Ray talk about football was one of my favorite sounds in the world. I went to the grocery store and came back with too much food, and Dot fussed at me for spending money and then cooked everything I brought. I did not tell them what I had done with the phone call. I did not tell them who I was. Not yet. The displacement notice stopped being discussed. Renee called twice, I think. Both times Ray answered and kept it short. Whatever she was pushing, he wasn't engaging with it. On the fourth day, Dot reminded me about the party. Grandpa Joseph was turning 80, Ray's father. A man so sharp and so present that I sometimes forgot he was in his 80s at all. He quoted scripture and current events in the same breath and had an opinion about everything worth having an opinion about. The party was being held at his house in Collier Heights, a backyard thing. Family and close friends. Dot had already promised to bring her macaroni and her pound cake. I told her I was coming. She said, "Good. Wear something nice." Then she paused. "Not because it matters, just because Daddy Joseph would appreciate it." I smiled. I know. I wore what I wore. Dark jeans, a clean blouse, the same gold hoops. My idea of nice has never been everyone else's, and I had stopped apologizing for that somewhere around age 20. But I did bring a gift. The gift was a bottle of Pappy Van Winkle Family Reserve, 23 year. If you know bourbon, you know what that means. If you don't, just understand that it is one of the most sought-after spirits produced in the United States. The kind of thing people wait on allocation lists for. The kind of thing that sells for several $100s if you can find it at retail and considerably more if you can't. I had gotten it through a connection in Louisville and had it shipped to my hotel. I wrapped it simply. No bow, no elaborate box, just brown paper and a card with Grandpa Joseph's name on it in my handwriting. I drove myself over to Collier Heights in a rental, arrived just after 3 in the afternoon, and walked through the side gate into the backyard where about 40 people were already settled into lawn chairs and folding tables and the orbit of 2 grills putting smoke into the air. Grandpa Joseph saw me from across the yard and called out, "There she is, we could go, so," in that big voice of his. And several people turned to look, and I crossed the yard and hugged him properly. The kind of hug where you hold on for a real moment. "Happy birthday," I told him. He held me at arm's length and examined my face the way he always did, like he was taking a reading. "You look like something's sitting on you," he said. "I'm fine, Daddy Joseph. Fine." "You're fine," he repeated, not quite agreeing. Then he let it go and clapped his hands together and said, "What did you bring me?" I gave him the bottle. He turned it over in his hands, read the label, and went very still for a moment. Then he looked up at me with those eyes, bright, sharp, entirely present. "Girl," he said quietly, Where did you get this? Someone owed me a favor. He laughed, not loud but deep, from somewhere genuine, and shook his head. You always been something else, Zara. He held the bottle like it was something worth keeping, which it was, and went to put it inside with the other gifts. I had not been standing there 3 minutes when Marcus materialized at my elbow. He looked at the bottle in Grandpa Joseph's hand as he walked away. What was that? Bourbon, I said. What kind? The good kind. He made a face that was trying to be unimpressed. You didn't get that from around here. That looked like something you found on clearance somewhere. I turned and looked at him. Just looked. Didn't answer. He shifted his weight slightly, the way people do when their comment doesn't land the way they meant it to. I'm just saying, Daddy Joseph likes a certain quality. You know how he is. I know exactly how he is, I said, and turned back toward the grill. The afternoon moved the way backyard parties do. Loosely, warmly, with pockets of conversation breaking apart and reforming like weather systems. Dot set up her food on the table, and people came from across the yard to get to her macaroni before it was gone. Ray was in a lawn chair near the fence, talking to one of his old postal buddies, laughing at something I couldn't hear from where I stood. Renee arrived fashionably late with a store-bought sheet cake and the energy of someone who had been ready to perform since getting dressed that morning. She moved through the yard greeting people, volume at a constant 7, complimenting the people she wanted something from and faintly dismissing everyone else. She found me near the drink table and started in almost immediately. I don't know why you're still in those jeans, she said, not unkindly but not kindly either. You came all the way from DC and didn't bring anything nicer? I brought what I needed, I said. Zara, I'm just trying to help you. People are going to be looking at you and thinking, I'm not here for people to look at me, I said. I'm here for Daddy Joseph's birthday. She made a noise in the back of her throat that wasn't agreement. You know Darius's family might be coming by later? The Whitfields? Kevin called Ray about it. You two are still… No, I said. We're not still anything. She tilted her head. Right. A pause. That's a shame. That was a good connection. A connection. That was the word she used. Not a relationship, not a person you cared about. A connection. I said nothing and filled my cup. Darius Whitfield. I have spent a long time figuring out how to talk about Darius without making him the villain of a story that doesn't actually have clean villains. Because the truth is more uncomfortable than a villain. The truth is that Darius was someone I genuinely loved, and he made a choice. And the choice told me something I didn't want to know. We met 3 years ago at a mutual friend's housewarming in DC. He was tall, easy to talk to, the kind of man who listened when you were speaking and actually responded to what you said rather than what he'd been waiting to say. We were together for almost a year. It was quiet and real in the way that the best relationships are. Not dramatic, just present. He met Ray and Dot over a video call, and he was good with them, natural, no performance. And then his parents came to visit him for a weekend, and everything changed. I never met Kevin Whitfield formally during those 2 days. I didn't need to. I could read what happened in Darius's face when I saw him after, a kind of careful distance that hadn't been there before, a politeness that replaced intimacy. 3 days later, he asked if we could talk. We sat in his apartment, and he said things that were clearly rehearsed, things about timing and where they both were in life, things about his family having certain expectations. And then he said it. The sentence I have replayed more times than I would ever admit to anyone. Zara, I love you, but my family has a certain standard, you understand. And the worst part, the part that still gets me when I think about it, is that I did understand, not in the way he meant it. I understood that he was choosing something over me, and that the something was his family's approval, and that no matter what I felt or what we had built, I was not going to compete with that. I had too much dignity and too much love for myself to try. I told him I understood. I picked up my things. I left. I cried in my car for about 20 minutes. Then I drove home and called Dot. And I didn't tell her what had happened, just told her I missed her. She talked to me for an hour about nothing important, and by the end of it, I felt almost okay. I had not spoken to Darius since. The Whitfields arrived at 4:45. Kevin Whitfield came through the gate with the energy of a man who believed his presence was a gift to any room he entered. He was in pressed slacks and a sport coat, which was deeply overdressed for a backyard birthday party, and he had a bottle of wine tucked under one arm that he presented to Grandpa Joseph, with the kind of fanfare usually reserved for much larger moments. Darius was behind him. He had on a simple button-down, sleeves rolled to the elbow. He looked, I noted this without much feeling, tired. Older than I remembered, though it had only been 2 years. He had the look of someone who had been making choices he wasn't fully comfortable with and carrying them quietly. He saw me from across the yard. I watched him see me, watched the recognition, then the complicated thing that moved through his face. Not quite guilt, not quite relief, not anything simple. He looked down at the grass for a moment. Then he looked back up. I looked away first. Not because it hurt, because it didn't need to go anywhere. Kevin Whitfield made his way to Ray within 5 minutes. I watched it from where I stood near the folding tables. Kevin had a way of positioning himself. A hand on the shoulder, a lowered voice, leaning in slightly, the body language of someone making you feel like you're the only person he's talking to. It was a very practiced thing. I had seen it before in boardrooms, and I recognized it for what it was. A setup. Whatever Kevin was saying, Ray was nodding. But I could read Ray's body the way I'd spent 22 years learning it. His shoulders had that particular set that meant he was listening politely and not agreeing with a single word. Marcus appeared beside me. He had been watching Kevin too. "Good dude," Marcus said. "Kevin Whitfield. He's got serious connects in real estate. City council, zoning boards, all of that." "I know who he is," I said. Marcus looked at me sideways. "You do?" "Yes." He opened his mouth, closed it, decided to let it go. The evening got louder as it went on. Someone brought a speaker out and the music drifted across the yard. Old school. The kind that made the older folks nod and the younger ones move without thinking. Grandpa Joseph held court from a lawn chair draped with a gold birthday sash someone had put on him, laughing and receiving his guests like a man who had earned every one of those 80 years. Dot was happy. That's the thing I kept coming back to. Watching her move through the party, talking to people she'd known for decades, laughing at something Grandpa Joseph said, looking for a moment completely unburdened by the thing that had been sitting on that house on Ashby Street for weeks. I wanted to protect that. I wanted it with a fierceness that surprised even me. Renee got the attention of the yard around 6 o'clock. She had picked up a plastic cup, her third or fourth of the evening, and she raised it and announced she wanted to say a few words. People settled. Smiles. "I just want to say how grateful I am," she started, warm and smooth, "to be here celebrating Daddy Joseph with all of these beautiful people. This family has been through a lot, and we've always come out the other side. We've got people who've done well, people who've come up, people who've made us proud." She swept her gaze across the yard with a smile. "And we've got people who, well, God has a plan for everybody, and I truly believe that." Her eyes landed on me for just a fraction of a second, then moved on. Laughter rippled through the crowd. the soft, communal kind that rises when something sounds like it's supposed to be funny. Some people didn't catch the edge in it. Some people did. Ray's jaw tightened. I saw it from across the yard. Dot looked at the ground. Grandpa Joseph looked at Renee with an expression that was unreadable. That old, still face of his that I had never been fully able to interpret. I set my cup down on the nearest table. I was not angry. Anger would have been too simple, too consuming. What I felt was something closer to clarity, the kind that settles over you when you've been watching something build for a long time, and you've finally reached the point of being done watching. I pulled my phone from my pocket, opened my messages, found Andre's name at the top of the thread. I typed 4 words. Come to Collier Heights. I sent the address of Grandpa Joseph's house. Then I added, bring the file, tonight. I put the phone back in my pocket. The toast was still going on. Renee had moved from backhanded family appreciation into something about the importance of elevating yourself and choosing your circle wisely. People were still smiling and nodding, the way people do when they sense the vibe has shifted but can't quite locate the source of the shift. I looked across the yard at Darius. He was watching Renee too, but his face was different from the others. He wasn't smiling. He looked faintly uncomfortable, the way he used to look when he witnessed something he knew was wrong but wasn't sure what to do with. That had always been his problem. He could identify the thing clearly. He just couldn't act on it. He caught me watching him and held my gaze for a second. I looked away without urgency. Kevin Whitfield, I noticed, had moved close to Ray again. He was speaking quietly, head angled down, and I could see in Ray's posture that whatever was being said had some weight to it. Ray's hands were in his pockets. He wasn't laughing. Kevin put a hand on his shoulder, that move again, and said something that made Ray's chin come up just slightly. I needed to get closer without it looking like I was getting closer. I moved through the yard at the pace of someone going to refill their drink, and I came within range just as Kevin was saying, low and reasonable. The thing is, Ray, Monroe Capital isn't going to back down on this. I know people on that development team. The way they see it, the whole block has to clear for the project to pencil out. And trust me, you'd rather take their first offer than wait for the second one. Ray was quiet for a moment. How do you know what their plans are? Kevin smiled. I'm in the business. I hear things. So, you're not just here for the birthday. Kevin had the grace to look mildly embarrassed, but just mildly. I'm here because I respect you, Ray, and because I think you deserve to know the full picture before you make a decision that affects your whole family. Is that right? Ray said. Not a question. The particular flatness he used when he had made a judgment and was simply letting someone finish their sentence before ending the conversation. I did not intervene. I moved past them toward the drink cooler. I didn't look at Kevin. I didn't need to. Darius found me 20 minutes later near the back fence where the light was thin and the music from the speaker was just barely loud enough to give the conversation some cover. He came the way he always had, directly, without a lot of preamble. I had always respected that about him, even when I wished he'd chosen a different direction to be direct toward. Zara, he said. Darius. He stood next to me, hands in his pockets, looking out at the yard for a moment like he was gathering something. I wasn't sure you'd be here. Why not? It's Daddy Joseph's birthday. I know, he exhaled. I didn't know if you'd want to be in the same space as me. I don't have a problem being in the same space as you, I said, which was true. The absence of desire is not the same as the presence of animosity. He turned to look at me, and I could see him working toward something. I've thought about what I said a lot, how I handled things. He stopped, started again. I was wrong, the way I said it. You didn't deserve that. No, I agreed. I didn't. He blinked slightly. He had been expecting more resistance, I think. People often do when they come prepared for a fight. I still think about it, he said. About us. I took a breath, looked out at the yard, at Grandpa Joseph holding court, at Dot laughing at something, at Ray standing quietly near the edge of the gathering, a man made entirely of dignity. Darius, I said, I believe you. I believe you thought about it. I believe you regret how it happened. I paused. But regret is different from having been worth something in the first place. And I think you know that. He was quiet. You made a choice, I said. People do. And then they live with what the choice says about them. That's all. He didn't answer. There wasn't really anything to answer. Somewhere near the front of the yard, I heard a car door close. Then another. I straightened up slightly, not dramatically, just the small internal shift of someone who has been waiting for a particular moment to arrive and has just clocked its arrival. Through the side gate of Grandpa Joseph's backyard, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who didn't need to announce himself to be noticed, came Andre Cole. Suit jacket on a Saturday evening, a leather portfolio in his hand, walking like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He was not alone. There was a woman beside him I recognized as part of the Monroe legal team. The yard didn't go silent. Parties don't go silent suddenly. They go quiet in waves. First the people closest to the gate, who turn to look, then the next ring out. Then the music still played, but it felt somehow smaller, the way background sound does when foreground attention has shifted. Andre scanned the yard, found me, gave me the slight nod that meant everything was in order. Kevin Whitfield was standing 8 feet away from me. I watched the precise moment he recognized Andre. It happened in his eyes first. A quickening, a recalibration. His whole body registered it a half second later. He leaned slightly toward Darius and said something I couldn't hear. Darius looked toward the gate, looked back at me. And I saw it happen in real time, the question forming in his face that he didn't yet have the language for. The way he was looking at me now versus 10 seconds ago, like the version of me he'd been talking to had not yet fully come into focus, and something was correcting the image. Kevin Whitfield took 2 steps in my direction. He cleared his throat. "Miss Carter," he said, using the wrong name, the one he'd filed me under. Do you know that man?" I held his gaze for a long moment. Behind him, I could see Renee watching, Marcus beside her, his plastic cup stopped halfway to his mouth. Ray, across the yard, perfectly still. Grandpa Joseph, from his chair with the gold sash, he was watching me too. And his expression was not confused, not alarmed. He was watching with the slow, certain patience of a man who had been alive long enough to recognize when something that had been building for a very long time was finally arriving. I did not answer Kevin Whitfield. Instead, I started walking, slowly, unhurried, toward Andre. There is a particular kind of silence that has nothing to do with sound. The music from the speaker was still going. Someone near the grill was still talking. A child was still chasing another child around the side of the house, sneakers slapping the concrete. All of it continued, technically. But the 40 or so people in that backyard had oriented themselves, without anyone announcing that they should, toward the spot where I was walking, toward the man in the suit coming through the gate on a Saturday, toward whatever the collision of those two things was about to produce. I closed the distance between me and Andre in about 12 steps. He handed me the leather portfolio without ceremony and said, quietly enough for only me to hear, "The Carter property has been formally removed from the acquisition list as of 11:17 this morning. The regional director's file is in there, 3 prior complaints, 2 undisclosed conflicts of interest with the development group. Council is recommending suspension pending full review." He paused. "Your father also called. He said you'd know what that means." "Thank you, Andre." "Of course, Miss Monroe." He said my name, my real name, at a volume that was not a shout, not a whisper. It was simply the volume of a man stating a fact in a normal register. In a quiet enough yard, at close enough range, it carried. I heard Renee say behind me, "Monroe." I turned around slowly. "I want to tell you that I had prepared for this moment, that I'd rehearsed something, some clean, decisive speech, the kind that lands perfectly and wraps everything up in a way that feels satisfying. But the truth is, I hadn't. I had played out 100 versions of this conversation in my head over 2 years, and all of them felt like performances. And standing in that yard, in the amber light of a November evening, surrounded by people who had known me since I was a child, performing was the last thing I wanted to do. So I just said the truth. I said it to the whole yard because the whole yard was already listening. My biological father is Winston Monroe. He's the founder and CEO of Monroe Capital Group. I've been part of the company's leadership for the past several months. I paused. Let that sit. I didn't say anything because I needed time. I needed to do this right. And I needed to know who in this family was showing up for Ray and Dot when there was nothing to gain. I looked at Renee when I said that last part. Not to be cruel, just to be clear. The yard processed this the way human beings process things they weren't prepared for. In pieces, in the wrong order, some people catching up faster than others. Grandpa Joseph, from his chair with the gold birthday sash still draped over his shoulder, let out a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, something in between. He shook his head slowly, like a man settling a long-held suspicion. "I always said this child was something else," he announced to no one in particular. "Nobody ever listened to me." He took a sip of his drink. 80 years old, and I still know what I'm looking at. That broke the tension just enough for a few people to exhale. Renee did not exhale. Renee went through approximately 4 different expressions inside of 5 seconds. Shock, recalculation, embarrassment, and then, with an agility I had to almost admire, a pivot into warmth. "Baby," she said, stepping forward. Her whole register had changed, the performing sharpness gone, replaced by something softer and very sudden. "You know, I have always loved you. You know that, right?" Everything I said. "That's just how I am. I joke around. I never meant—" "Renee," I said, not unkindly, just firmly. "You don't have to explain." She stopped. "I know exactly how you are," I said. "That's the thing. I've always known." She searched my face for something, an opening, a softening, something she could work with. She didn't find it. Not because I was cold. I wasn't cold. But because there was nothing left there for her to negotiate with. I wasn't angry enough to punish her, and I wasn't generous enough to pretend. Marcus was standing about 4 feet behind his mother. He had put his cup down somewhere. His hands were at his sides, and his face had settled into something I had never seen on him before. Something uncertain, almost young. He made a move as if to say something, and then seemed to decide against it, which was, genuinely, the smartest decision I had ever witnessed him make. From across the yard, Kevin Whitfield had begun moving. There was something almost mechanical about it, the way he smoothed his jacket, adjusted his posture, recalibrated everything about his approach inside of 3 seconds. He was a man who lived in the world of pivots, and he was executing one now. Darius put a hand on his father's arm. Kevin moved past it. "Ms. Monroe," Kevin said, and the name came out of his mouth with the ease of a word he'd been practicing his whole life. This is quite a surprise. I have to say, I have enormous respect for your father's work. Monroe Capital has done some remarkable things for this community, really remarkable. And I think what you're doing, taking over the leadership at your age, Mr. Whitfield, I said. He stopped. You were just telling my father over there. I tilted my head toward Ray. That Monroe Capital wasn't going to back down. That he should take the first offer before the second one came. The yard was very attentive now. Kevin's mouth opened slightly. He had the expression of a man who had just realized the floor he was standing on was not the floor he'd thought. I was sharing information I'd heard. I didn't mean to imply. You also suggested that this birthday party was an appropriate place to pressure an elderly man to give up his family home. I kept my voice even. Even is more powerful than loud. That tells me what I need to know about how you conduct business. Kevin looked at Andre. Andre was looking at the middle distance, expression professionally neutral, the way very good professionals can be. If Monroe Capital has any further communication for the Carter family regarding the Vine City development, I said, it can come through legal counsel. That property is off the table. It was off the table as of this morning. I looked at Kevin directly. You came here tonight for nothing. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was not meant to be. Darius was watching his father. I could see in him the particular suffering of a person watching someone they love be reduced in public, not by cruelty, but by truth. He looked at Kevin the way you look at something when you've been seeing it clearly for a while, but haven't admitted it to yourself yet. Kevin gathered himself, nodded once, stiffly, turned and walked toward the gate. Darius didn't follow him immediately. He stood where he was for a moment. And then he looked at me with an expression I didn't have a name for. Not quite remorse, not quite comprehension. Something in the vicinity of both. He took 3 steps toward me, stopped. Zara, he said. He pressed his lips together, started again. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. No, I want to. What I said to you 2 years ago, what I let my family say without standing up. Darius. My voice was quiet, not dismissive, genuinely quiet. I'm not angry at you, he blinked. That was not what he'd expected. I was, for a while, I said, and then I wasn't, because holding on to it would have cost me more than it cost you, and I decided a long time ago that my energy was worth more than that. I looked at him steadily. But being not angry doesn't mean being available. Do you understand the difference? He held my gaze. And to his credit, to the real credit of whatever was actually good in him, he didn't argue. He just nodded. A slow, real nod that meant he understood even if understanding it was not comfortable. I hope things are good for you, I said. And I meant it. I meant it the way you mean something when it genuinely no longer has the power to hurt you. He nodded once more, and then he walked toward the gate where his father had gone. The party didn't end. That's the thing nobody tells you about moments like that. The world keeps turning at its exact same speed. Within 10 minutes, someone had turned the music back up. Within 15, people were fixing plates again, refilling drinks, gravitating toward Grandpa Joseph and the warmth of his chair and his stories. Renee left shortly after. She said her goodbyes with a careful brightness, the performed version of normalcy, and Marcus trailed out after her without making eye contact with me. I did not watch them go. There was nothing more to see there. What I watched instead was Ray. He had been standing near the back fence for most of it. Through the reveal, through Kevin, through Darius. He had not moved, had not intervened, had not said a single word that I could hear. He just stood there, in his quiet way, the way he always did when something large was happening and he was letting it happen and waiting for his moment. His moment came about 20 minutes after the crowd had resettled. He crossed the yard toward me, his walk the same unhurried walk he'd always had. And he stopped about a foot away and looked at me for a long time. His face was doing something complicated, something I had seen on him before, in smaller versions, in smaller moments. The look of a man holding more than he has words for. "You known this for 2 years," he said. "Yes." "And you didn't say nothing?" "No." He exhaled through his nose. Not angry, working through something. "Why?" I took a breath. Because I needed to meet him first. I needed to know who he was. I needed to know what all of it meant before I brought it to you, because once I said it, I couldn't take it back. I paused. And because I was scared, if I'm being honest. Scared of what? That things would change between us. He looked at me for another long moment, and then he did something unexpected. He laughed, a short, real one, the kind that doesn't have any performance in it. "Baby girl," he said, "you are not going to get rid of me that easy." He shook his head. "Didn't matter when you were 4 years old and they brought you to that house. Don't matter now." Something unlocked in my chest. I felt it like a physical thing. "Ray, your last name don't change what you are to me," he said. "I don't care if it's Monroe or Carter or something else entirely. You're my daughter. That happened a long time ago, and it is not reversible." I nodded. I was not going to cry in this yard. I decided that somewhere in the last hour. And then Dot appeared beside Ray, and she didn't say anything, the way she sometimes didn't. She just put both her hands on either side of my face, the way she had when I was little, the way she had when I was sick or scared or needed something she knew she couldn't fix with words. She just looked at me, right at me, and in that look was everything. 22 years of it, all of it, present in one moment. I did not make it. I didn't cry hard. It wasn't that kind. It was the kind that happens when you've been holding something at arm's length for a very long time and your arms finally give out. My eyes went hot, and I let it happen for about 30 seconds, quietly, while Dot held my face and Ray put one hand on my shoulder, and the party continued around us. And Grandpa Joseph's music played, and the sky above Collier Heights stayed that amber-lit city dark. 30 seconds. And then I breathed, and then it was done. The three of us stood there for a moment longer, not saying anything, not needing to. That was the thing about the Carters. They had always been a family that understood the value of just being in the same space. You didn't have to fill it. I found Grandpa Joseph before we left. He was inside by then, seated at his kitchen table with a small group of his oldest friends, the bottle of Pappy Van Winkle open on the table and a glass poured at his elbow. He was telling a story that was making everyone at the table lean in. He looked up when I came in and waved me over. I crouched down beside his chair. He turned toward me and lowered his voice just slightly, the way he did when he was saying something he meant for one person. "You know what I kept thinking about?" he said, while all that was happening out there. "What?" He picked up his glass, considered it for a moment. "I kept thinking, this child has been carrying something heavy for a long time, and she didn't ask anybody to help her carry it." He looked at me. That's strong, but it's also a little sad. I didn't have an answer for that. You can put some of it down now, he said. You don't have to hold all of it by yourself anymore. He held my gaze for a second, long enough for the words to settle. Then he raised his glass slightly and turned back to his friends and resumed the story without missing a beat. I stood up, walked back out into the evening. It was after 9 when we finally left, me and Ray and Dot together in the rental. Dot sat in the front and Ray stretched out his knee in the back the way he did on longer rides. We drove through Collier Heights and back toward the west side, through neighborhoods I had spent half my life learning, streets whose names I knew the way I knew my own face. Nobody said much. We didn't need to. The silence in that car was the good kind, full instead of empty, settled instead of tense. I dropped them at the house on Ashby Street. Ray went up the porch steps first, unlocking the door, turning on the light inside so the front window went warm against the dark. Dot paused on the bottom step and turned back to look at me. You eating breakfast here tomorrow? She said. Not a question. Yes, ma'am, I said. She went inside. I sat in the rental in front of the house for a minute, just looking at it. The porch, the light in the front window, the magnolia tree at the edge of the yard that had been there longer than any of us. The house that had been flagged as an acquisition target by a spreadsheet somewhere, reduced to a dollar figure and a coordinate on a development map. The house where someone had loved me when they had every reason not to. My phone buzzed. I looked at the screen. Unknown number, but a Virginia area code I recognized. My heart did something quiet in my chest. I answered, Zara. The voice was Winston Monroe's, measured, careful, the voice of a man who thought before he spoke and spoke only when he was ready. I heard things went well tonight. Andre called you. He did. I'm glad. A pause. I'm flying into Atlanta on Thursday. I'd like to meet them, if they're willing, properly, in person. I'll ask them, I said. I think they'll say yes. Good. Another pause, longer this time. The kind of pause that has something in it. There's also something I need to tell you, Zara. Something I should have told you when we first met, but I wasn't ready, and that wasn't fair to you. I kept my eyes on the lit front window of the house. It's about how you were lost, he said. There are things about that night that I've never told anyone outside of law enforcement, about what actually happened. His voice was careful and low, like someone placing something fragile on a surface. It wasn't an accident. None of it was. The street was very quiet. What do you mean? I said. Even though something in me, that part of me that had always been too good at reading rooms, at hearing the undercurrent of things, had already begun to understand. I mean, someone took you, he said, and I have spent 22 years knowing that and carrying it, and not knowing how to say it to you without... He stopped. I need to say it to you face to face. I owe you that much. I stared at the window of that house, at the warm square of light, at everything that had been my life because of a single night I had no memory of. Thursday, I said. Thursday, he confirmed. I ended the call. I sat in that car for a long time. The light in the front window of the house on Ashby Street stayed on. Some information doesn't hit you all at once. It lands at the edges first, in the peripheral, in the quiet, in the space between waking up and remembering where you are. I drove back to my hotel that night, and I showered, and I got into bed, and I stared at the ceiling for a long time. And the word Winston had used, took, kept surfacing in my mind the way a word does when your brain is still deciding what to do with it. Took. I am 26 years old. I have sat in rooms with people who had more power than I did, and I have held my position. I have read financial statements that would make most people's eyes glaze over and found the one line that tells the real story. I have made decisions that moved money the way weather moves, invisibly, until suddenly everything is different. And lying in that hotel bed, I felt 4 years old in a way I have no adequate language for. Not weak, not broken, just small. In the specific way you feel when something that happened before you were old enough to protect yourself from it comes fully into focus for the first time. I called no one. I just let myself feel it. By morning, I had decided something. Whatever Winston had to tell me on Thursday, I was going to hear it without armor. No prepared responses, no professional distance. I had spent 2 years building careful structures around this part of my life, approaching it methodically, strategically, on my own timeline. That had been right for that stage, but this part, this final piece of the origin story, required something different from me. It required me to just be a person who needed to know the truth about her own life. I got up, got dressed, and went to have breakfast with my parents. Dot made biscuits, not the canned kind, actual biscuits from scratch. The ones that required her to work the butter into the flour with her hands the way she'd learned from her own mother. The kitchen smelled like it had on every significant morning of my childhood. Butter and coffee and something faintly sweet. The combination that meant someone who loved you had been awake before you were. Ray was already at the table with his newspaper. An actual paper, because he had never trusted news that didn't have a physical weight to it. He looked up when I came in, said good morning, went back to his paper. Normal as breathing. We ate without ceremony. That was the gift of it. No processing session about the night before. No emotional debrief. No one asking me how I was feeling about everything in that careful, therapeutic tone that well-meaning people sometimes use. Dot put food on the table. Ray talked about an article he'd read about the Hawks. I refilled my own coffee because I knew where everything was. At some point, Dot sat down across from me and looked at me in her particular way, not searching, just receiving whatever was there, and said, "You sleep?" "Some," I said. She nodded, didn't push it. "My biological father's coming Thursday," I said. "He wants to meet you both, in person." I paused. "You don't have to. There's no obligation." Ray set his paper down. He and Dot looked at each other, one of those married people communications that happens above the level of words, the whole conversation compressed into a glance. "He can come," Ray said. Dot said, "I'll make something." And that was that. No drama, no conditions, no questions about what it meant or what would change. They were who they had always been, people who made room. Thursday arrived the way consequential days always seem to. Entirely ordinary on the surface, unremarkable in its weather and its light, asking nothing special of the morning. Winston Monroe did not send a car or make a production of the arrival. He texted me from the airport that he'd landed, and 40 minutes later, an unassuming black sedan pulled up in front of the house on Ashby Street. He got out alone. No assistant, no Andre, no security. He stood on the sidewalk in dark slacks and a simple charcoal sweater and looked at the house for a moment, the way a person looks at something they've been imagining for a long time. I met him on the porch. He looked at me the way he had in that Charlotte coffee shop 2 years ago, like something focusing after a long blur. He was 61 years old with a build that suggested he had once been an athlete and had stayed disciplined into age. He had my same instinct to be still when he was thinking, the same habit of listening with his whole face. I had noticed these things early, and they still unsettled me in a quiet way. The recognizing of yourself in a stranger. "Thank you for letting me come," he said. "Thank you for being honest with me on the phone," I said. He nodded. Then he looked at the front door and took a breath. Are they? How should I? Just be yourself, I said. They'll do the rest. Dot welcomed him the way she welcomed anyone who came to that house, with food already on the table and the assumption that you had probably not eaten enough that day. She shook his hand, looked at him squarely, and said, "We've been taking good care of her," which was not aggressive, but was also not entirely not a statement of position. Winston received it exactly right. He said, "I know you have, and I am more grateful for that than I have words for. I mean that." Something in Dot's face settled. Ray shook Winston's hand and then did the thing he did when he was genuinely taking the measure of someone. He held the handshake a beat longer than social convention required, just long enough to look at him directly, just long enough to say without words, "I am paying attention to you." Then he let go and said, "Sit down. You want coffee?" They sat at the same kitchen table where I had eaten biscuits 2 days before, and for a few minutes they talked about small things: the flight, the neighborhood, whether Collier Heights had changed much since the 90s. Ray had a way of moving through small talk that wasn't dismissive of it. He understood that small talk was how people calibrated each other before the real things got said. Eventually, it got quiet. The particular quiet of a table where everyone understands that something significant is about to be placed on it. Winston looked at Ray and Dot together. Then he looked at me. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All of you." The story he told us lasted 40 minutes. I want to give you the shape of it, not every detail. Some of it belongs only to that kitchen, to those 4 people, to the particular weight of that hour. But the essential truth of it was this. In the fall of 2002, Winston Monroe had been in the middle of a bitter legal dispute with a former business partner, a man named Gerald Pruitt, who believed he had been forced out of what had originally been a joint venture and who had spent 2 years attempting to leverage lawsuits and regulatory pressure against Monroe Capital. The dispute had reached a critical point. Pruitt had found, through means Winston only later discovered, that Winston's greatest vulnerability was not financial. It was personal. It was a 4-year-old girl who rode her tricycle in the driveway and called for her father by name, and trusted the world completely because no one had yet given her a reason not to. Pruitt had not meant for it to go the way it went. That was the particular cruelty of the thing. It had not been a planned kidnapping in the full sense of the word. Pruitt had arranged for someone to take me, intending to use my disappearance as leverage, intending to return me once Winston backed down from the legal proceedings. But whoever he'd hired had panicked. I never learned the precise sequence of what happened, and had abandoned me rather than return me. And the trail had gone cold, and then the trail had gone dark. And 22 years had passed. Pruitt was eventually convicted of securities fraud unrelated to this, and was dead before I was old enough to understand that his name should mean something to me. Winston had cooperated with law enforcement for years. He had never stopped. He had hired private investigators. He had followed leads across 4 states. And then, at a certain point, he was careful with how he said this, and I could see it cost him. He had stopped being able to look at the investigation every day. Not because he gave up, because continuing to look every day without finding anything was its own kind of destruction. Your mother and I? He stopped, started differently. Claudette never forgave herself. She was inside the house when it happened. She was on the phone for 7 minutes, and she has counted those 7 minutes every day since. He pressed his hands flat on the table. I am telling you this not to assign blame. I am telling you because you deserve to know the full truth, and I waited too long to give it to you, and I am sorry for that. The kitchen held all of this. Ray had been listening with his hands folded in front of him, elbows on the table. He was quiet for a moment after Winston finished. Then he said, in the measured tone he used when he had thought something through completely, "The people who hired to take her, they left her in Atlanta?" According to what investigators eventually reconstructed, yes. And she ended up at a church outreach 3 days later? Yes. Ray nodded slowly. Then she ended up exactly where she was supposed to end up, he said. Not defensively, as a plain statement of what he believed. I'm not telling you that to make you feel better. I'm telling you because it's what I think is true. Winston looked at Ray for a long moment. His eyes went bright in a way that a man like him, composed, controlled, accustomed to maintaining his surface, clearly had not planned for. He blinked it back, nodded once. Dot, who had been listening without moving, reached across the table and put her hand briefly on top of Winston's, just for a second. Just enough. I sat at that table and watched the man who gave me life and the people who built my life exist in the same room, and I did not have a word for what I felt. It wasn't one thing. It was everything at the same time. Grief for what had been taken, gratitude for what had been given, the strange vertigo of holding two origin stories in the same hands and knowing both of them were real. I excused myself after a while and went outside. The backyard, Dot's garden, the dark November soil, the fence I'd leaned against 4 days ago, while making the call that changed the shape of everything, received me without comment. I sat on the back steps and listened to the sound of the neighborhood. A car passing, the distant bark of a dog, a door somewhere closing. I thought about Gerald Pruitt. I thought about the 7 minutes Claudette Monroe had been counting for 22 years. I thought about whoever had been hired to take a child and had panicked and had left her somewhere and driven away. I thought about the 3 days I had no memory of. 3 days between when I disappeared and when I appeared, as if from nowhere, at a church outreach on the west side of Atlanta. I had expected, when I finally heard this story, to feel rage, something volcanic and consuming, the kind of anger that reorganizes a person from the inside, and it was there. I won't pretend it wasn't. There was a real and present fury at what had been decided about a 4-year-old without her knowledge, without her consent, for reasons that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with the greed and desperation of men who treated the world like a transaction. But underneath the anger was something I hadn't expected: relief. Not the easy kind. The difficult, complicated kind that comes when a question you've been carrying your entire life finally resolves into an answer, even an answer that hurts, even an answer that opens other questions. I had not been left. I had not been unwanted. I had not been the kind of story where a family looked at a child and decided she was too much trouble. Someone had done something terrible, and the terrible thing had rippled outward, and I had landed in the hands of two people who chose to keep me when they could have handed me back to a system and walked away. That was the thing I kept returning to. In all the chaos of what Pruitt had set in motion, the one decision that was made out of pure, uncalculated love was the one Ray and Dot had made. They had not known who I was. They had not known I came from money or connections or a family that was looking for me. They had just seen a child who needed a home, and they had given her one. I sat on those steps for a while, and I let myself feel all of it: the grief, the fury, the strange, tender gratitude, without trying to organize it or resolve it into something cleaner than it was. And then I went back inside. The four of us sat together for another hour. The conversation moved differently after the hard part. Lighter, more careful, people learning the shape of a new kind of room. Winston asked Ray about his years with the Postal Service with genuine curiosity. Dot told a story about the first week I came to live with them, how I had refused to sleep in the bed she made up for me, and had instead dragged the pillow and blanket to the doorway of her and Ray's room and slept on the floor just outside it, because I needed to be able to see that they were still there. She told the story warmly, without weight, the way she always had. But I watched Winston's face while she told it. He looked like a man receiving a blow he had agreed to stand still for. When it was time for him to go, he stood on the front porch with me while Ray and Dot were inside, and he said, "I want to do something for them, for this house, for this block. Not as compensation, because there isn't a compensation that makes sense, just as something real." "I know," I said. "I've already started it." He looked at me with something I recognized as pride, and also something more complex than pride. The particular tenderness of a parent watching a child who had managed to become entirely themselves without any help from you, and feeling grateful and humbled and a little heartbroken all at once. "The Community Preservation Initiative goes through council next week," I said. "The Carter neighborhood will be formally protected under the new framework. The development project gets restructured around it, not through it. Businesses, homeowners, everything stays." I paused. "The regional director who filed those displacement notices has been suspended. The review will be completed by end of month." Winston nodded. "And you did all of that before I arrived?" "Yes." "Good," he said, simply, without trying to take any portion of it. In the weeks that followed, things resolved in the ways that things do. Not with the dramatic punctuation of a final scene, but gradually, in small movements. In the quiet, ordinary way that real life actually works. The Meridian Vine City Mixed Use Initiative was formally restructured. The new development absorbed the parcels that had already been transferred willingly and was redesigned to incorporate the remaining properties as a surrounding community rather than an acquisition target. A preservation covenant was attached to a cluster of homes in the neighborhood, including 1847 Ashby Street, which meant that block would remain as it was, would remain theirs, for as long as the law held, and we intended to make sure it held. The regional director's suspension became termination after the review concluded. The two undisclosed conflicts of interest with the development group had produced decisions that materially harmed the residents in the acquisition zone. Andre handled the administrative process with his usual precision. I signed the final authorization from the Monroe Capital offices in Midtown, which was one of the stranger moments of that whole period. Signing a document in a building I had been turned away from at the door 6 days earlier. Renee never called me directly after Grandpa Joseph's birthday. She called Ray twice in the month that followed. Careful, uncharacteristically restrained conversations that Ray reported on with the brevity of a man who had already decided what he thought and didn't need to relitigate it. She was not removed from anyone's life in a declarative way. She was simply no longer inside of mine. There is a certain kind of distance that doesn't require an announcement. It just becomes apparent over time, the way the tide reveals what was always on the shore. Marcus sent me a LinkedIn connection request 7 weeks later. I declined it. Kevin Whitfield emailed Monroe Capital's general business inquiry address in late December. Andre flagged it in his weekly summary with a single parenthetical. "No reply sent, per your standing instruction." I moved on to the next item on the list. Darius. I saw him once more, and it was accidental. I was coming out of a coffee shop near the Monroe Capital offices in January when I almost walked directly into him on the sidewalk. He was startled. I was not. We stood there for about 4 seconds, long enough to register each other, long enough for whatever remained to confirm its own smallness. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I said. And then I went right and he went left, and that was, in its own understated way, exactly the right ending for that particular chapter. The last thing I want to tell you about, the thing I've come back to most in the months since all of this unfolded, is not the reveal, or the confrontation, or any of the moments that probably sound like the most significant ones, it's a Saturday morning in December. I had come back to Atlanta for the weekend, no particular occasion, just wanting to be there. I drove over to Ashby Street in the morning and let myself in with the key I'd always had, and Ray was in his chair with a football game on, even though it wasn't even noon yet, which was a habit I had teased him about my entire life. "You're early," he said. "Traffic was light," I said. Dot was in the kitchen. She looked up when I came in and pointed at the cabinet where the cutting board was kept, which meant she needed help and was not going to spend any energy asking for it. I washed my hands and stood beside her at the counter, and we worked together the way we always had. Her rhythm, me following it, neither of us needing to negotiate the choreography of that kitchen, because I had been learning it since I was old enough to stand at the counter. We didn't talk about Winston. We didn't talk about Monroe Capital or the development project or Renee or any of it. We talked about whether the sweet potatoes needed more time and whether Ray had remembered to pick up the right kind of rolls and whether Grandpa Joseph was coming for dinner. He was. He arrived at 2:15 and immediately found a problem with how the television volume was set, which was typical of him and exactly right. We ate at the table where I had first read those displacement papers 3 months before. The same table, the same chairs, the same afternoon light coming through the kitchen window at the same angle. But the weight that had been sitting on that table when I arrived in November was gone. Actually gone, not suppressed or relocated, but resolved. The house felt the way it always had at its best, like a place where people were safe. After dinner, I sat on the porch with Ray. He had his sweet tea and I had mine. The block was doing what the block did on a weekend. People moving, kids somewhere up the street, music from someone's open door. The magnolia tree at the edge of the yard had gone dormant for winter, stripped back to its essential structure. But even without its leaves, it had a presence. The kind that comes from something that has been in one place long enough to belong to it fully. Ray rocked slightly in his chair, not because it was a rocking chair, just because that was what he did when he was content. "You good?" he said after a while. "Yeah," I said. "I'm good." He nodded, sipped his tea. "You know what I think about sometimes?" he said. "I think about that little girl who dragged her pillow to sleep outside our door because she wanted to know we were still there." He was quiet for a moment. Breaks my heart a little, but it also tells you something, right? About what a person is made of. He glanced at me sideways. She figured out pretty quick who was worth staying near. I looked at him, this man with his rough hands and his newspaper and his laugh that filled rooms. This man who had given me 30 years of something I did not have the right language for, except to call it home. "Yeah," I said. She did. People ask me sometimes, now that pieces of this story have found their way out into the world, what it felt like. They want to know about the reveal, about the look on faces when they found out who I was, about the satisfaction of watching rooms reorganize themselves around a truth they hadn't been prepared for. And I understand why they ask. That's the part that sounds like the point. That's the part that sounds like justice. But if I'm being honest with you, and that is the only reason I've told you any of this, the moment that mattered most to me in that whole stretch of time was not standing in Grandpa Joseph's backyard watching Kevin Whitfield realize he'd played the wrong hand. It was not walking past Gerald the security guard and into the elevator without looking back. It was not Renee's face reorganizing itself into warmth at a speed that told me everything I needed to know. The moment that mattered was 30 seconds in a backyard in Collier Heights, when Dot put her hands on my face and Ray put one hand on my shoulder and the party kept going around us. And no one needed to say anything because Everything that needed to be said had already been said in the years before that moment. That was what I had been protecting. That was what all of it was for. The people who had shown up for me when there was nothing to gain, they were my people. They had always been. No last name changed it. No revelation clarified it. It was already a fact before I walked back into Atlanta, before I ever picked up that phone, before I ever sat in a Charlotte coffee shop across from a man who had my grandmother's eyes. I already knew who I was. I had learned it in a house on Ashby Street, in a kitchen that smelled like butter and coffee and something sweet, on a porch where the magnolia tree had stood longer than any of us. All that happened was everyone else finally caught up. If something in this story found you, if you've ever been the person in the room that nobody took seriously, if you've ever had to carry something heavy while pretending the weight wasn't there, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what part hit you hardest. Tell me your version of the Ashby Street house. Everyone has one. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is the time. There's more to come, and I promise you it's worth staying for.